second. All right, so now we are live and we're recording, just FYI.
Excellent.
Okay, here we go.
Great.
So we've got some people rolling in. I think we had about 40 registered. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, we should have a pretty good crew. So we'll give them maybe another minute or so to come in. Oops.
And are we all good to go with the polls?
Yes, yep, so just
Awesome.
let me know whenever you're ready, and I can just pop those up.
That's great.
We have Karen from Estes Park here. Hi, Karen.
Okay, we'll give people a couple, maybe another minute.
Yeah, we're at about 23 and rising rapidly, so we'll start in another minute or so. For all of our attendees who are rolling in, if you'd like to drop us a little message in the chat and just tell us where you're zooming in from, just so we have a little bit of an idea. All the way from Houston.
Oh, great.
Yeah, we've been getting some really good reach with these webinars. We've had people coming in all the way from like New Jersey and Maine. So that's
Awesome.
one benefit of doing it virtually, is we're not just limited to Colorado-Wyoming.
Oh, and Laura, I wanted to ask you, if people want to ask questions, should they put them in the chat or in the Q&A?
So either one works. I will kind of be maintaining the Q&A throughout, so you can kind of upvote questions in the Q&A if people want to know the same thing. So I'll keep an eye on those, and if I see a lot of people asking the same question, I might kind of pop in and just ask you to clarify something.
Yeah.
We'll try and answer everybody's questions. We'll depends on how many questions they have, but yeah, once we get going, I'll kind of fade into the background and just be here for troubleshooting and helping out with the Q&A. So
great. Okay. And then to Michael's question, I think that if they still have time, Michael, they could register with the same link that you used.
Yes. So just forward. Actually, I wonder if I can put the link. Is that like am I going to create some kind of weird loop if I put the Zoom registration link for the webinar in that webinar's chat? But I can certainly try that. If
it might be like looking into two mirrors.
I know. But also, if anybody's wondering, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available either through Zoom. So if you register after it starts, you'll get a link to view the recording through Zoom, and then we will put it on the Colorado-Wyoming Association of Museums YouTube page, and that'll be available through the QAM website or through YouTube. So there are lots of options to watch it if you can't watch it live. And if you still want to invite someone, you can copy and paste that link. It should let you jump in even if we've already started. Which we're at 28 people now, so we're pretty good on our numbers, so I think we'll get started. I guess first of all, hello everybody, and thanks for tuning in on a Friday morning. My name is Laura Brawarney. I'm with the Colorado-Wyoming Association of Museums, or QUAM, if you're not familiar with our acronym. This is part of our webinar series that we have been doing kind of throughout COVID, since we had to cancel our conference this year. And it's also good practice for us because the 2021 QUAM conference will be entirely virtual, so stay tuned for that. Will Gregg here is the archivist for the University of Colorado Museum of Natural History, not National History, that's different. And so he was generous enough with his time to kind of alter his conference presentation to a webinar. So he is going to present for us today. I will be around to help with Q&A, but I'm going to kind of fade away now and let Greg take over. Thanks, Greg.
Sure. Okay.
Will,
thank
sorry.
you. Oh, no worries. That happens a lot.
I'm sure that happens all the time.
Yeah, it definitely does. That's a burden of having two first names. So yeah, thanks everyone for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you today about image processing and cleanup. This is kind of a large topic, so I'm going to try to hit on the broader points and give us some tools for how to do this from home. But before we get started, I want to just say, again, thanks to Laura and QUAM, and then also thanks to the National Archives who funded the project that kind of gave birth to this presentation. And then to get started, I think we have a couple of polling questions. I just wanted to get a good idea for you all's experience with doing this kind of thing and kind of your needs and stuff you have at hand. So if we could go ahead and put those in the field.
Is this the first poll question, Will?
Gotcha.
Will, are you waiting for the poll? Sorry.
Yes. Yeah. Oh,
sorry,
perfect.
I missed
Okay.
my cue.
Yeah, so the first one, I just wanted to know, do you all have prior experience renaming or organizing large batches of images? Wow, total 50-50 split. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so for some of you who do have a little bit of experience with this might be a bit of a review, but you can see how I do things differently. And for those of you who don't, hopefully this will give you some introductory tools to really get started. And then if we could go to the next one. Awesome. Okay, so it looks like a lot of us do, so that's useful for me to know. And then the next one is our last poll question. Okay, another kind of mix. So for those of you who don't have access to Adobe, Photoshop, and Bridge, the things I'm talking about can sometimes be applied to other similar photo editing programs. So don't despair if you feel like it's too Photoshop specific. If you have another photo editing program, you could probably apply the same skills. But with that, thank you for filling that out, everyone. That's helpful for me just to get started. And I'll go ahead and start the presentation. Okay, so once again, we're talking about at-home image processing and cleanup. And to start, I just wanted to go over what I think are the basic facets of image processing. So I kind of think of this as divided into 3 tasks. So there's naming and renaming your files, your image files, or other files if you're working with other kinds of files. And there's also organizing and storing your images. You know, where are you keeping those, and how are they sorting when they're in the folders. And then we also have image editing, which is kind of that post-processing step where you go back and make things look better. So with those in mind, I kind of wanted to give you a little bit of background on me and the project I've been working with. So I've been working on a processing and digitization project for an archival collection, and it's the papers of Earl H. Morris, who is a Southwest archaeologist active in the American Southwest and Mesoamerica. And he had a long-standing relationship with CU Boulder, which is how his papers ended up at the Museum of Natural History. And we've been doing a lot of digitization. So far we have about 5,000 images and counting. And some of those are paper materials, some of those are photographs. So I have been doing a lot of thinking about how to do image processing and cleanup as a result of this project. And just kind of a glimpse into what our workflow has looked like. The way we've been doing things is we've been scanning those items in batches. I'll then go in and edit the file names. And once those are looking good, I create JPEG copies of those files for our general use. And then I'll do the image editing, make the photos look how I want them to look. And once everything's kind of ready, I'll duplicate the images and put them in a place that's suitable for long-term storage. Now, your project might have a really different workflow depending on what you're trying to accomplish with image processing. But just to give you a basic idea of what it might look like and where I'm coming from, that's been our workflow. So to start, I'd like to talk about image naming right off the bat. And I think that all of us kind of have an idea for what we want our files to look like in their file names, but that's often not the reality. So I kind of have 2 examples here. On the left is what I consider to be sort of the reality, and on the right is what I consider to be more of the ideal. The left is definitely a little bit messy. As you can see, there's capitalization all over the place. There's hyphens being used and underscores being used for the same function. The dates come sometimes at the end, sometimes at the beginning. And on the right, we have a more kind of regular system where things are sorting properly. So how do we get to the place where our file names actually look good? I think that we need to consider kind of 3 principles for file naming: the consistency, flexibility, and legibility. So with consistency, I mean, we want to apply the same rules to our file names in the same way across, ideally, a whole institution. But if that's not possible, at least within the same folder or for the same project. So if you're going back and cleaning up a bunch of photos that you have taken of your exhibitions over previous years, you want to make sure that you're naming all of those files in a way that's consistent. And then also flexibility is important. So when you're coming up with those rules for how to name your files, you want to think about the problems you might encounter. So an example from our work, this seems like something that's quite simple, but we had come up with this good rule system, but then we came to our first piece of paper that had information on both sides. And so we hadn't foreseen that problem. We thought, well, should we say front back? Should we use AB, recto verso? Should we just go give both sides of the paper a different number, even though they're the same kind of item? That's the kind of problem that, while simple, can cause you kind of a headache if you don't think about it in advance. And similarly, anticipating future needs, by that I mean thinking about not just you and your project, but people coming 5, 10 years down the line. So if you're coming up with names for or rules for how to name files, think about what kinds of projects people might be working on at your institution in the future. And then also legibility is important in that when you're looking at a file folder full of images or other files, you should be able to kind of sort through them with as much ease as possible. You shouldn't have too many files that look really similar or are basically identical. And then you also want them to display in the proper order. So for you, that might be chronological order. Like in this previous example, maybe it's really easy for you to find images if they're chronological. Alternatively, you could structure them as alphabetical by subject or any other system that works for you. So I just wanted to give you a quick example from what our files look like from this project. These are our JPEG files in our file folder. We used an alphanumeric naming system, which was good for us because each of these unique names or identifiers corresponds to a record in a database. So it was really easy for us to look up that number in the database or look up an image in the database, find the number, and then go find it in the file folder. I would recommend this kind of alphanumeric system if you have a database or a way to reference your photos in that way. But if you're working with a smaller number of photos or you're not working with an external database, then naming them in a more descriptive way can be useful too. Okay, so to get into tools for how to do this, whether you're naming images on an upcoming project or you're renaming a bunch of old images, both of these tools could be of use to you. The first I'm going to talk about is bulk rename utility, and the second is Adobe Bridge. So just to compare and contrast real quick, bulk rename utility is a really easy to set up program. It's free for in-home non-commercial use, but there are also pretty reasonably priced licenses available. And it includes a lot of different renaming functions. Adobe Bridge, by contrast, is a little more specific to photographs, so it presents visual information in addition to the file name. But in my experience, that also makes it a little bit slower when you're working with a large number of images. And it also has fewer built-in functions than bulk rename utility. For that reason, I kind of recommend bulk rename utility as a tool to start out with. And we're going to be looking at that in more detail. So I'm going to go ahead and switch my screen over to bulk rename utility just to kind of give you a demonstration for how that could work. Let me just find it real quick. There we go. Okay, sorry for the delay there. Okay, you should all be able to see the bulk rename utility tool. So just to go over the anatomy of the tool, on the left you have your file folder navigation, which is how you get to the image that you want to work with. In the middle here, we have our file names on the left, and in the new name column, that's a preview screen of what they're going to look like once we do the renaming. And at the bottom, we have all the various functions that you can perform in bulk rename utility. And as you can see, there are quite a few. There are 2 or 3 that I use way more than the other ones. Just to give you an idea of how you might use this tool, I'll go through some basic functions here. So as you can see, we have our file names here on the left. And in this scenario, we might be a local history museum who did a digitization project, but maybe our interns didn't do such a good job with naming our photos. And so now we kind of have a little bit of word soup going on. In order to clean these up, I'd like to do a couple things. First, I'd like to talk about that hyphen and underscore problem. So they're being used in the same way through different file names, and I'd like to just make them consistent. So I'm going to go over here to the replace function. I'm going to select this, and I'm going to replace hyphens with underscores. And then I'm going to tell the program what images I want to work with. So I want to work with everything in this folder. And as you can see now, 3 of these file names are highlighted in green. And these are the ones where changes are actually going to occur. And if I was okay with how this looked, I'd go ahead and hit rename. But one of the cool things you can do with bulk rename utility is perform multiple functions at the same time. So I'll go ahead and show you another function that we can add on. I mentioned earlier that we have a lot of crazy things going on with the cases. And I'd like things to be consistent because that's a principle in our file naming. So I'm going to go ahead and make everything lowercase, apply that function. And now you can see that everything is highlighted in green because it's changing in one way or another. So this looks pretty good to me. I'm going to go ahead and rename my files. And when you hit rename, you get this warning message. You can always disable this if you don't want to be bothered by it again. On the other hand, if you're being really cautious, you can go to the preview screen. This preview screen is useful because if you're working with a large number of files, there might be a subset of those that you think could be problematic. And you can do a find, little keyword search to bring up those file names you're worried about and just make sure everything looks okay before you actually rename them. In this case, there are only 10 file names on our screen. I feel pretty good about them. So I'm going to go back here and click OK. And this doesn't take usually quite this long. My network connection is sometimes a little slow, so it's almost instantaneous usually. Okay, and now our files are looking a lot better, but there's some other functions that we can perform to make things even nicer. Before we move on to those, you want to make sure that you clear the data from the last functions you were working with so you don't accidentally apply them again. And one thing I'd like to do now is I'd like all of the dates in these file names to come at the beginning rather than the end. So there are several ways you could do this, and sometimes you have to get a little creative with bulk rename utility. The way that I think is most efficient in this situation is to select all of those file names that have the same date and then insert the year at the beginning of the file name. So now we have all the 1932 files selected. I'm going to go to this add function and I'm going to enter a prefix. So prefix will always come at the beginning of the file name. If you wanted to insert something in the middle, you could use this insert function. If you wanted it to come at the end, you could use the suffix function. I'm going to go ahead and apply this. And now you can see that 1932 is showing up at the beginning. That looks great. So we're going to go ahead and apply that change. Now I'd like to do the same thing for the ones that end in 1945. So let's go ahead and select those, change our prefix to 1945, and rename. Okay. So now you can see that we have the dates all coming at the beginning of the file names, but there's a problem in that our dates still come at the end of some of these file names. And the way to handle this most efficiently, in my opinion, is to select all of these and do a remove function. So we're going to go over here to the remove, and you can remove characters from the first part of the word or the file name, the last part of it, or from the middle. We want to remove the last few characters. I'll show you what that looks like. Let's go ahead and apply this and then just start counting up until it looks good. So if we do 4 characters, our date disappears. And if we do 5, we get that unnecessary underscore also. So that's looking pretty good to me. I'm going to go ahead and rename those. Great. Okay. And then if you resort these, they appear in chronological order. So that's kind of just a brief introduction to some of the basic functions you could perform with bulk rename utility. At the end of the presentation, I'll be sharing a link where there will be some further resources and also kind of a take-home instruction that you can do. So I'll give you the tools to repeat these exact steps and check your work in case you want to get a little more experience with it. Bulk rename utility is also nice because, due to the fact that it asks you to confirm your changes, you really have a lot of freedom just to play around with your file names without messing anything up. So I'd encourage you just to play around with the tool, and the forums, which I'll link to you, are also really useful if you're new to the tool. So now we'll go ahead and go back to our presentation. Okay, so I'd like to talk about Adobe Bridge. Adobe Bridge is another way to rename files in batches. So in order to access that batch rename function in Adobe Bridge, you want to first go to the desired folder and then go to the Tools menu and click Batch Rename. And then for most purposes, you'll use the string substitution function. And we'll go ahead and see that. So I'll switch over to Adobe Bridge here. If it shows up for me. It's not immediately apparent. Sorry, while I dig around. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see Adobe Bridge now. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate to a folder. Okay, so in Adobe Bridge, again, you'll get to the folder that you want to work with. You'll go to Tools and select some files. And then select battery name. So Adobe Bridge, as you can see, has quite a bit of a simpler screen than bulk rename utility. There's really just one function that's displayed there, and that's find and replace. And for most things that you want to do, this is actually maybe adequate, but we'll get into how to do more complicated things as well. But just to start with something simple, let's say that I was working with these Anytown photos and you know, a light bulb went off and I realized that those pictures of Anytown were actually pictures of downtown Denver. So in this case, I want to find Anytown and replace with the word Denver. Similarly to bulk rename utility, the new file name will show up in the preview. And if you want to be really cautious, you can also hit this preview button. It will show you the files that are about to be renamed. And you can export those as a CSV to check them over in a spreadsheet if you like. So in the case that you're ready to go ahead and rename things, you just hit rename, and you can see the files have now changed. If you want to do more complicated things like inserting characters at the end or deleting characters from the end of a file name, you have to use something in Adobe Bridge called regular expressions. Some of you who are a little more tech proficient than me might already be familiar with regular expressions. To me, it was something that was really new and a little bit complicated to learn, which is why I kind of shy away from Adobe Bridge if you're just getting into this stuff. But I'll go ahead and show you what it looks like just as an example. So let's try to remove these last 4 characters. I'm going to try to take the date off of these file names. So let's go to battery name. And regular expressions are what you would use to do this, and they kind of look like a piece of code. So in this case, you use a period, 2 squiggly brackets, and a $sign. And you want to make sure you have the use regular expression function checked. And you're going to go ahead and enter the number of characters you want to delete plus the number of characters used for the file extension. So I want to delete 1945 plus these 4 characters, the file extension. I'm going to enter 8. And you can see in the new file name that 1945 is now deleted. So again, this is a bit more complicated than bulk rename utility, but there are resources out there to help you learn the regular expressions. And you can also save an expression. So I could call this delete last 4 for future use so that you don't have to be remembering these expressions every single time. Okay, great. Let's go ahead and move on. So that's Adobe Bridge in a nutshell. Now I'd kind of like to just, in one slide, talk about image storage considerations. Just some basic points to hit on in case you're approaching this problem for the first time. So when you're storing your images, you want to think about the importance of file type. And the main reason this can be important is kind of you're thinking about the difference between a master copy and a use copy. So especially if you're doing a digitization project where you're digitizing items as kind of a semi-permanent record of that item, you want to make sure that that first digital image that you create is kind of put away somewhere safe and locked, if you will, so that it doesn't get messed with in the future. So for that, you know, I take our TIFF images that we create right off the bat, and I make copies of those as JPEG images. And all of those JPEG images are the ones that I do stuff with. So those are the ones that I'll edit. Those are the ones that I'll share or put online. The TIFF images sit in a folder and hopefully no one touches them. And that's because The less they're used, the less they could be corrupted, and you can just be sure that that chain of custody is maintained from digitization to it being a permanent record. Then you also want to think about high quality versus low quality. Some file types are more predisposed towards a high quality image. So a TIFF generally serves as a better high quality image, whereas a JPEG or a PNG serves as a better low quality image. Storage space obviously is important when you're thinking about storage. Particularly if you're going to create multiple copies of your images, you want to think about how much space is that going to turn up. So for us, we have 5,000 TIFF images, and then I also have to build in the storage space we need for 5,000 additional JPEG images. So just to kind of plan that out in advance before you start processing your images can be useful. And then I wish that all of us had dedicated digital asset management systems, and we had a team of people making sure that our images were safe in the long term and that nothing bad would ever happen to them. But realistically, not all of us are working with a dedicated DAM. So redundancy is something that we kind of have to do on our own. If you're kind of bootstrapping this and starting it from the ground up, one way to make your images redundant is to just store them on different hard drives or on different networks, so that if something should happen to one machine, you don't lose all of your images. Ideally, you would store images in different geographical locations as well. That way, if a major disaster happened, you wouldn't have all of your backups ruined at that point. I wanted to talk a little bit about cloud storage. So cloud storage is increasingly becoming a popular way for cultural heritage institutions to back up their images. I think that this can be good for images that are kind of more casual nature, but if you're working with things that are sensitive or their privacy and access restrictions, I would hesitate before putting them in a third-party run cloud storage. Just another consideration to think about. So that's a quick introduction to storage, but I'd like to move on for lack of time to photo editing. And this is the part I really get excited about because I think it's just very interesting visually and fun to play around with. So for photo editing, we're going to be focusing on Adobe Photoshop, but some of the terms that we'll be using translate to other photo editors as well. So some of the basic tools I find myself using very frequently in Adobe Photoshop are in the adjustments menu. So to access those in Photoshop, you'll go to Window and then hit Adjustments. And within that adjustment window, I often use levels, brightness, contrast, and hue saturation. And I'll just show you these now so that you can get a look for or get a feel for what they do. So here we're going to go to this image and look at these different tools. So we'll go to Window, Adjustments, and you'll see those little icons pop up that I was showing you earlier in the PowerPoint. The first one that I generally like to work with is levels. Levels is a really important image or a really important adjustment to start with. If you have an image that's really washed out or an image that's too dark, levels is kind of the first place to go. And that's because you can adjust these sliders to adjust how much light is getting captured in the image, basically. So we have in the levels adjuster, dark on the left side, light on the right side. And then this graph here is showing you where all your pixels fall on that spectrum. So if I wanted to lighten up my image, I would make it so that we're not counting as many of these pixels. That would make it brighter, and then sliding the darkness bar to the right makes it darker. And then you can also adjust the grayscale in between. So for this image, we're already sitting in a place that's pretty good, but I might just play with it a little bit to make it a little more legible to the eye. And once you're satisfied, you can just hit this arrow and the adjustment's been made. The next thing I generally like to go to when I'm editing images is brightness contrast. So contrast is a really important tool for increasing legibility. It's kind of what our eye looks for when we go to an image. So bumping up the contrast is a good way to make the image feel more readable. I will say that if you're doing a digitization project and working with archival images, you want to be careful not to eliminate a lot of the information on the screen by bumping up the contrast. The higher that goes, the more your darks become really dark and some of the detail can get lost. So just be cautious of that. So for this one, I might bump up the contrast just a little bit and go ahead and adjust the brightness. In this case, I like it a little bit darker than it was. And a little goes a long way, I'll say. You know, you usually don't need to go all the way down on the slider. And then the final thing I like to do is adjust the hue and saturation. You can see in this image that there's a little bit, I'll just try to zoom in on it. There's a little bit of blue, and that's because this is a digitized image of a glass plate negative, and the glass plate corrupted over time and caused the image to kind of develop this hue that shows up when it's scanned. So if I wanted to reduce that, I could go to hue saturation, go to the saturation bar and adjust this. Saturation is a reflection of how much color is present in an image. So if I move this bar down to the left, you'll see the image becomes increasingly black and white. Just to give you an idea for what the other tools in this menu can do, hue can change the tone of the colors. And lightness is actually really similar to the brightness function. So I usually don't have cause to use this, but if brightness isn't cutting it for you, you can always come back to this tool and try to do further adjustments. Okay, so in this case, I'd like to reduce some of that blue tinge. So I'm going to turn the saturation down a bit. And at the end, we end up with a pretty legible image. Let's go back into our PowerPoint here. So you may be wondering, I mean, if you're working with several hundred or thousands of images, it's not very efficient to do that to each image individually. There is a way in Photoshop to do edits in batches. So you can select all the images in a folder and create a batch process that applies the same operation to all those images. I've used this quite a bit, and it's really been a lifesaver for me. So what I use it for is creating those JPEG use copies for all the images. Sometimes I need to brighten up a whole bunch of dark photos. If I scan a photographic negative, I'll turn it into a positive for the use copy. And then also sometimes photos just need cropped, and they all need cropped in the same way. So this is a real big time saver. You know, you can run this process and then go drink your coffee and feel pretty good about yourself. So just so you have it on record, the way you open or perform these batch edits is to go to the window Actions, and then create new action. You'll do the thing that you want to be done to all the photos. You'll hit stop recording, and then you'll go to File, Automate, and Batch. And I'll show you how that works just so you have a basic understanding of it. Okay, we'll go back into Photoshop. So again, I'm going to go to Window, and then Actions, and just delete these real quick. Let's say that I had a whole folder of images that were inverted, so they're negatives rather than positives. What I want to do is turn those into positives. So I would start recording an action to do that. And the way you do that is you hit this little plus button. You're going to name your action. So I'm just going to call this invert. And then we'll start recording. And at this point, I'm going to do the thing that I want done to all of the images in the folder. So we're going to start from the beginning. I'm going to go to Open. I'm going to find my image. And then I'm going to hit Control-I to invert. We're going to save that image. And it doesn't matter at this point what folder you save it in, by the way. So we'll just call this image. We'll save it as a JPEG. When I'm doing this, I generally like 8 for my use copies. I'm going to hit OK. But at this point, you can see in our new invert action, we've opened, inverted, saved. The last thing we need to do is close the image. Okay, so at this point, that's all the steps we need to invert one image. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this square, which is stop recording. And now this is a new batch process. So the way I apply this batch process is I'll go to File, Automate, Batch. And we're going to select first the folder that we want to work with. So I'm going to select with these before images. I'm going to work with those, select that folder. I'm going to make sure my action is the one I want, that it's the invert action. You want to click override action open commands and also suppress color profile warnings. That kind of just gets rid of pop-ups that will show up and saves you a little bit of time. And then I want to choose where I want these images to end up. So I could have them end up in the same folder, in which case they just replace the old images. But I could also put them in a new folder, which is what I'm going to do here. So we're going to put them in this after folder. Select. And then this is looking pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And you can see that it's opening each image in turn. And it's going to invert it and save it. So if you need to rehash that process, again, in the resources that I'll link you, there's a take-home exercise to do the same thing. And then I'm also going to put some video tutorials for you just so you can go back and really learn this in detail. All right, let's head over back to the PowerPoint. Okay, and just to kind of wrap up, I'd like to talk about some alternatives to Photoshop. So if you're starting from scratch and you don't already have a photo editing software and you don't have a budget to purchase Photoshop, which can be quite expensive, you might look at Pixlr, GIMP, and Paint.net. All of these are free. They work on all the major operating systems. And what's more, they kind of have similar names for their functions and commands that Photoshop does. So if you go into these programs, you might recognize some of the functions based on what we just talked about. All right. And then for take-home resources, if you would like to dive into some more detail about these, you can access a Google Drive folder with this link. It's open to anyone who has the link. In there, I have kind of a bibliography and a further reading screen where you can check out more resources and tutorials. I also have those exercises that you can perform for batch renaming and batch editing photos. And with that, thank you. I'll just say, if you want to contact me with questions or recommendations you have with resources, feel free to get in touch at the email above. And now we'll open it to Q&A if there are any questions.
All right, so Will, I don't know if you can open up the Q&A box, but we do have a few questions in there. Beth has a simple one about Bridge, just wondering if it comes with instructions about all of those formulas that you demonstrated.
Yeah, Beth, unfortunately, not really. I haven't, what I wanted when I first started working with Bridge was like a list that showed all of them. Okay, you know, you want to do this, use this function. The only way I've been able to find anything like that is just to do a lot of Googling and try to find use cases where people have said, this is how I did this particular thing. But from what I can tell, no one has compiled an authoritative list for these regular expressions. Regular expressions are used in a lot of different areas of computing. So it might be the case that if you're familiar with them from another area of computing, you could apply them to Bridge with the same result. But unfortunately, you're kind of on your own with trying to find the functions. So the next one, do we use volunteers for photo processing? If so, what parts? Definitely, yeah. So in the pre-COVID era, we had a volunteer who's helping us out a lot. Mostly that volunteer was doing the actual digitization, but occasionally she did help me with file cleanup. So I would have her go through and just make sure that the file names were consistent and that there weren't any like glaring errors. If she found some, she could either fix them herself, or if there were a large series of problems, then I would kind of take it on to do that batch editing. So do you ID each image and then put each image in the database, or do you batch your photographs in the database? Good question. Yeah, so we in this project, we're processing our photographs to the item level. So each photograph has a unique identifier in the database. And then I would write that unique identifier on the enclosure that houses the photograph, so that when you're browsing through the physical storage materials, you would actually be able to find the thing that you're looking for without opening the package or something like that. And I guess I should also say a word about metadata related to that. Um, I like doing it at the item level. I mean, you could do your photographs in batches, and not do a record for each one. And I think that's actually maybe more common. But because of this particular project, we really had to be cautious about where we were applying access restrictions. And to do that properly, we really needed an individual record for each photograph, which is why I did that. But though it's more time intensive, that also means that our metadata for each photograph is really great. And how to batch delete or move certain files. I have hundreds of folders and only want to move or copy files with a raw in them. Batch delete or move certain files. That's a great question. You know, I haven't had to do this particular thing myself. Let me think about that for a second. I think that the thing that I would do, I mean, with what you're talking about with trying to select all the ones that have raw in them, I think that there is a way, and don't necessarily quote me on this, but I think there is a way to do a search for all of the raw extensions. So if you said like .raw, you could select all of those and then move them into a separate folder. And once they're in that separate folder, you can delete them hassle-free or move them around without worrying that you're accidentally getting other ones in there. That would be my recommendation, to see if there's a way to kind of do a search and select for all of those. As far as I know, there is not a way to do that with bulk rename, utility, or bridge, but I may be wrong about that. It would be something worth looking into. Okay, so Michael asks, any concerns with cloud-based storage and security? You touched upon this briefly, but does the Art Museum Digital Humanities Fields broadly accept cloud-based storage and using cloud storage in addition to an external hard drive? Yeah, this is a really good question. I think that cloud storage is really tempting to use because the server that the images are being backed up on is most likely nowhere near where you are. I mean, it might be in the continental United States, but it's likely in a different state. And so if some major disaster were to happen, it really provides a nice foolproof backup. However, I really do think that there are security concerns, particularly with information that's private and you don't want available to the public. I just personally, you know, I would not put that on cloud storage. You still have, you know, you have control over the images in your cloud storage, but you're not technically the only one with control of those. And while a security breach of that nature might be extremely uncommon, it is theoretically possible. So if you have sensitive material, maybe you could isolate that, only store that locally, and put your non-sensitive material in cloud storage if you were really keen on using cloud storage. Okay, Janet asked, do I recommend that photo stick for storing photos? I'm not sure I know which photo stick, but I assume you mean a USB drive. And if you do have an external hard drive or a USB drive, that can be a way of making your storage redundant. However, I would caution, kind of along the same lines as the last question, if you have images that are sensitive or private, and you put them on an external hard drive, you want to make sure that you keep that in a place that's very secure and that no one's actually going to be getting onto it. For the same reason, you want to make sure that no one's using that hard drive just because they think, oh, neat, like a place to put my things, and then accidentally, you know, tamper with your photos. So if you're going to back them up on something that is a hard drive, not part of a computer, I would definitely make sure that that's stored in a place that's ideally not next to the computer that they're stored, the other computer they're stored on, and somewhere that's relatively secure. Do I think Past Perfect software product has the issues that I just mentioned? Personally, I'm not familiar with Past Perfect, but just speaking from our own, my understanding is Past Perfect is a database and collection management system. And if it's it's those kinds of collection management systems are dedicated towards use by cultural heritage institutions. So they kind of understand where we're coming from. If they're keeping images saved locally, like if you're attaching an image to your database in Past Perfect, and Past Perfect is saving that somewhere that isn't your own computer, I don't think there's as much reason to be concerned as putting those in cloud storage. But it just kind of depends on your level of comfort. I mean, anytime that someone else is saving a copy of something, I mean, it could generate access concerns. But I can't speak to exactly how Past Perfect does that. I'm not sure if they save a copy on your computer and then use that to upload to the database, if that's what you're doing, or if they have that on their own servers. So that would be something to look into.
So I have a question.
Sure.
As someone who doesn't really work with our archives very much, I'm watching you do these bulk changes and thinking, what is the undoability of some of these bulk changes? Like, what if I do something and I'm like, oh crap? Is it easy to kind of unbulk change?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's that's a really good question. So actually, bulk rename utility does have the Control-Z undo function. So you can undo at least one change. So if you mess up and you realize it right away, then yes. But you just, if you're working with a large number of files, I think you just want to be really, really sure that they look good. And viewing it in that tabular format and just kind of slowly scrolling through is useful. One thing I will say, kind of another reason that an alphanumeric code is useful as opposed to a more narrative description of your files, is that alphanumeric code is kind of the same number of characters across all of your images. And so if there's an irregularity, it's really easy to see it. Like if something's wrong with one of my photos, I can, even though I'm scrolling through thousands of images, I immediately say, that one is not right. Yeah. But if your file names were a little more narrative and they had different lengths and words and numbers going on, then it might be a little harder to make sure that you're doing the right thing. So maybe work with smaller batches, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah. Thanks. All right. It looks like you've answered everybody's questions. Do we have any last minute need to knows before we kind of close out? Looks like Janet put a question in the chat. And we talked about long-term storage. Janet, if you have any specifics about that, go ahead and put them in the chat. Otherwise, I want to say thank you to Will for joining us today. I certainly was taking notes over here. I learned some things that I'm going to pass on to our curator so that she can play around with them for sure. So you mentioned a lot of links, which I think the best way to disseminate those would be for me to just send a bulk email to everyone who attended today, rather than having them copy and paste them out of the chat. So for everyone who was wondering, I will go ahead and send you an email. So keep an eye open for that. It'll have all of these wonderful resources that Will mentioned. And then I will also include his email so that whenever you come across a stumbling block, you can kind of reach out to him, and hopefully you guys can start working on some of these large projects. The last thing I want to say is that once you close out of this window, you will see a link for a survey about this webinar. It looked like we have a pretty new audience because we haven't really done any webinars about archives yet. So I would love to have your feedback and opinions on what you'd like to see more of from QAM, what you liked and didn't like. So please take about a minute to fill out that survey as well. All right, Will, any last words for our archivists in this webinar?
No, just thank you all for coming, and yeah, I appreciate it. I was happy to do it.
Excellent. All right, so like I said, this has been recorded. You can access it through Zoom, and then in about a week or so, you'll be able to find it on the QAM website if you want to forward it along to anybody. And yeah, just keep an eye out for that email. All right, thanks everybody. Thanks, Will.
Thank you.